Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Alabama. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the summer of 1863, as the Civil War pressed heavily across the South, rural Alabama existed in a state of strained quiet. Farms operated with reduced hands, towns moved cautiously, and churches doubled as places of refuge and record. It was during this period that county notes first mentioned a child who did not fit into any existing category. The boy's name does not appear consistently in the records. In some entries, he is called simply the child. In others, he is described by condition rather than identity. What is agreed upon across testimonies is that he did not speak, not once, according to those who encountered him, and that he demonstrated an ability at the piano that witnesses struggled to explain. The earliest reference appears in a church journal kept by a lay clerk near Montgomery. The entry notes a visiting family bringing a child unable to speak, but possessed of uncommon musical capacity. The clerk wrote that the child approached the piano without instruction and reproduced hymns after hearing them once. No further commentary followed, as though the writer did not know how to frame what he had seen. Similar accounts began to surface elsewhere. A plantation ledger recorded time set aside for demonstration, an unusual term that appeared only once. A neighbor later testified that the boy's hands moved with precision, not hesitation, and that his posture suggested familiarity rather than learning. Observers struggled to describe what unsettled them most. Some pointed to the silence, others to the absence of formal training. A minister wrote that the child's playing felt complete, as though it came from somewhere finished rather than practiced. It was impossible not to draw comparisons to other known musical prodigies of the century. Later writers would reference figures like blind Tom Wiggins, whose extraordinary abilities were already being documented in the same era. But even among such comparisons, witnesses insisted this case felt different, not because of greater skill but because of the child's detachment from response. He did not acknowledge applause, he did not seek approval. County affidavits suggest that the child was moved between households over several months. Each stop produced similar testimony. He would sit at a piano, listen briefly, and then play. When asked questions, he did not answer. When addressed directly, he did not react. Only music seemed to prompt engagement. There were no accusations of fraud, no suggestion of trickery. The adults involved appeared more unsettled than impressed. One later statement reads simply, "It was not performance, it was disclosure." No formal investigation followed. In 1863, Alabama had little capacity for such matters. War consumed attention and extraordinary talent, especially in a child without voice, was treated as curiosity rather than concern. What unsettled later reviewers was not that the boy played so well, but that no one could explain where the music came from, or why it emerged only when a piano was present. And just as quietly as the records began, they paused. The boy did not remain in any one place long enough to establish continuity. He appeared, demonstrated, and moved on, leaving behind witnesses who agreed on what they had seen, but not on what it meant. By the end of that summer, The case had already begun to fragment into memory, and that fragmentation would define everything that followed. As the months passed after that first summer sighting, the child's presence became something discussed in private rather than recorded formally. Alabama in 1863 was not a place where anomalies were pursued methodically. Survival came first. Anything that did not interrupt it was allowed to pass. What survived instead were personal accounts, later testimony gathered from ministers, neighbors, and household members who claimed brief encounters with the boy. Their descriptions align closely. He was small for his age, neatly kept, and physically unremarkable except for the stillness with which he carried himself. Several witnesses remarked that he moved only when necessary, as if conserving effort. One affidavit, taken years later, described the first moment the boy was placed at a piano. He did not hesitate. He did not test the keys. He listened. After a few seconds, he began to play, matching not only the melody of a hymn he had just heard, but its tempo and emphasis. The witness emphasized that no instruction had been given. Another account noted something more unsettling. When the music ended, the boy did not stop immediately. His hands hovered above the keys for several seconds, as though waiting for something else to occur. Only when the room grew quiet did he withdraw. Church journals from the period mention gatherings where the boy was brought forward quietly, almost apologetically. There was no announcement, no expectation of entertainment, and yet, after he played, people lingered longer than usual. A minister wrote that congregants did not know how to respond without words. The comparison to known prodigies grew quietly. Some referenced traveling performers they had heard of, including the young blind Tom, whose abilities were already circulating through newspapers. But these comparisons never reached official print in Alabama. They remained spoken, cautious, and uncertain. What troubled observers was the absence of context. No teacher claimed him. No family history was offered. The adults accompanying him gave minimal explanation, often deflecting questions. One woman later recalled asking where the boy had learned to play. The response she received was, "He listens." By early autumn, the boy's movements became harder to track. County notes list a musical child appearing briefly near Selma, then farther east. No transport records exist. He seemed to arrive without notice and depart the same way. There were rumors, though none written at the time. Some speculated the boy repeated what he heard without understanding it. Others suggested he possessed an internal structure of music no one else could access. A few spoke cautiously of divine influence. No one spoke of deception. What united the accounts was restraint. No one exaggerated. No one claimed miracles. They described what they saw, then stopped. And perhaps most unsettling of all, no one reported the boy asking for anything. Not food, not rest, not acknowledgement. He played, he waited. Then he was moved on. By winter, his appearances had grown sporadic. Some assumed he had been taken elsewhere, possibly north. Others believed he remained nearby but unseen. There was no urgency to determine which. The case, already fragile, began to thin, and in that thinning, between admiration and unease, the questions that might have anchored it were quietly lost. By the winter of 1863, the child's appearances had taken on a different character. Where earlier accounts described small gatherings and private demonstrations, Later ones suggested increasing caution. The boy was no longer brought openly into churches or parlors. Instead, he was introduced quietly, often at the end of the day, when fewer people were present. A plantation journal from that season notes an evening visit by a silent child of musical capacity, followed by a single line written later in a different hand. Do not repeat. No explanation accompanied the instruction. Witnesses who encountered the boy during this period remarked on changes that were subtle but consistent. He appeared thinner. His clothing showed signs of frequent travel, yet his playing had not diminished. If anything, it seemed more precise, as though repetition had sharpened something already complete. One later testimony described the boy reproducing not only hymns, but fragments of conversation that had taken place nearby, translated into melody. A woman claimed she recognized the cadence of her own speech reflected back to her in the music. She said it unsettled her enough that she asked for the piano to be closed. Another witness recalled that when multiple people spoke at once, the boy did not play at all. He waited until the room returned to order, then began. This behavior was interpreted variously, as sensitivity, as discipline, as something harder to name. No medical assessments were recorded at the time. Doctors in rural Alabama were few, and the war strained resources further. Even if one had been consulted, it is unlikely the case would have been documented formally. The boy's silence was not treated as illness. It was treated as fact. By early 1864, the boy's movements became irregular. Some communities reported hearing of him but never seeing him. Others claimed brief encounters that could not be corroborated. The case began to fracture into second-hand accounts. It was during this phase that folklore first brushed against the story, not as explanation but as framing. A neighbor reportedly said the child held music the way others hold breath. Another suggested he was listening to something we cannot hear. These remarks were not recorded officially. They surfaced later, softened by time. What remained consistent was the absence of exploitation in the records. Unlike other prodigies of the era, there is no evidence that the boy was exhibited publicly for profit during this period. If such exhibitions occurred, they left no trace. The demonstrations described were restrained, almost reluctant. This restraint puzzled later reviewers. In a time when unusual talent was often capitalized upon, the handling of this child suggested discomfort rather than ambition. People seemed unsure what to do with what they were witnessing. A letter from a traveling minister offers a rare glimpse into that uncertainty. He wrote that the boy's playing inspired neither joy nor fear, but attention. "We listened because we felt we were being addressed," he wrote, "and we did not know by whom." By the end of that winter, references to the child dwindled further. His presence had become intermittent, then speculative. Some assumed he had been taken far from Alabama. Others believed he remained nearby, hidden by intention rather than accident. No one filed a missing persons report. No inquiry followed. The war provided sufficient explanation for disappearance of all kinds. And so, without announcement or conclusion, the case entered its most unstable phase, one where memory outpaced record and certainty gave way to impression. What the boy had been was no longer clear. Only what he had done remained consistent. He listened. He played. And then he was gone. By the spring of 1864, the child's story existed almost entirely through recollection. The war had reshaped Alabama's priorities, and with it, the mechanisms by which unusual events were noticed or pursued. What had once been quietly recorded in church journals or household ledgers now survived only in spoken fragments. Several later testimonies describe near-identical encounters from this period, though they occurred miles apart. In each, the boy appeared with one or two adults, was seated at a piano, and played without prompting. In each, the listeners struggled afterward to explain what they had heard, not because the music was unfamiliar, but because it seemed to reflect something personal, something already present in the room. A former schoolteacher recalled that the boy reproduced a tune she had hummed under her breath days earlier. She could not explain how he had heard it. The detail unsettled her enough that she did not mention it publicly until many years later. What began to concern witnesses was not simply the boy's talent, but his apparent indifference to audience. He did not adjust his playing based on reaction. He did not respond to praise. He stopped only when the sound in the room stopped. One account describes an abrupt end. The boy halted mid-phrase when a door slammed nearby. He did not resume. He stood, stepped away from the piano, and would not return to it that evening. No one could persuade him otherwise. This behavior introduced a new interpretation that the boy's playing was not voluntary in the way observers expected. It appeared contingent, reactive, dependent on environment rather than intention. There were quiet discussions about whether the boy understood the music he played. Some argued he must, given its structure. Others suggested understanding was not required, that replication alone could account for what he produced. These debates remained informal, unresolved, and brief. A county physician, consulted indirectly, noted that silence in children could result from trauma or developmental difference. He offered no explanation for the music. His remarks were recorded second-hand, then dropped. Comparisons to known prodigies resurfaced, including renewed mention of blind Tom Wiggins, whose abilities were by then gaining broader recognition beyond the South. Yet witnesses insisted the cases felt distinct. Blind Tom performed. This boy responded. By midsummer, references to the child became rare. Some believed he had been taken north, possibly to places where talent was documented more carefully. Others suspected he had been removed deliberately from view, as if those accompanying him wished to avoid attention. What is notable is the absence of resistance. No one demanded to know where he had gone. No one reported him missing. The boy had never been claimed publicly. Without a claim, there was nothing to lose. Later scholars would note that the child existed entirely within the margins of record, present enough to be remembered, absent enough to remain undefined. His silence shielded him from categorization. His talent complicated every attempt to dismiss him. By the end of 1864, the case had lost cohesion. There was no central thread to follow, no authority to collect testimony, no institution to preserve context. What remained was impression, shared, consistent, and unprovable. The boy had not become a story yet. He had become a question. And questions in times of upheaval often wait years before they are asked aloud. When 1865 arrived, the the war's end did not bring clarity to the case. Instead, it scattered what little structure remained. Records were reorganized, institutions reformed, and many private journals never returned to public view. In that reshuffling, the child's presence slipped further into uncertainty. A clerk tasked with reviewing church materials from the war years noted several references to a silent boy crossed through with no explanation. In one margin, someone had written, "Not ours to keep." The phrase offered no context, but it suggested a deliberate restraint, an understanding that the child's story resisted ownership. During Reconstruction, Alabama saw an increase in traveling performers and lecturers. Newspapers eagerly advertised talent. Yet there is no advertisement, notice, or announcement that clearly matches the boy. If he was ever exhibited publicly, it left no trace that survived the transition into peace. What did survive were later testimonies collected decades afterward, when people felt safer reflecting on the past. A woman recalled that the child had once played while standing rather than seated, his hands reaching awkwardly but accurately. She remembered thinking the instrument was too large for him, and that he seemed to be adjusting himself to it rather than the other way around. Another account described the boy pausing before a hymn and then playing it in a different key, one the witness preferred but had never voiced. The witness admitted this detail reluctantly, aware of how implausible it sounded. "I know how it reads," he said, "but it is what happened." These recollections were consistent in their modesty. No one claimed the boy spoke. No one claimed supernatural displays. The unease came from precision, not excess. By late 1865, the boy was no longer being seen. Rumors suggested he had been taken north with other displaced families. Others believed he had died quietly, his silence leaving no record of passing. No burial entry has ever been linked to him conclusively. What is striking is the lack of pursuit. No family came forward to reclaim him. No institution claimed responsibility. The child had moved entirely through informal channels, homes, churches, private spaces, and when those channels closed, he vanished with them. Later historians would argue that this invisibility was structural rather than accidental. A mute black child in wartime Alabama existed outside the mechanisms designed to track significance. His talent did not override that fact. It complicated it. The comparison to Blind Tom Wiggins resurfaced again in later commentary, often as a point of contrast. Blind Tom was documented, managed, recorded. This child was not. Where one became known through exposure, the other receded through silence. By the end of the year, the case no longer progressed. It simply remained, unfinished, unclaimed, and unresolved. The boy had entered Alabama's records briefly, left an impression strong enough to endure, and then slipped back into absence without resistance. No explanation followed. No conclusion was offered. Only a shared understanding among those who remembered him, that something rare had passed through their lives, and that it had done so without ever asking to be understood. By 1866, the child's story had crossed an invisible boundary, from recent memory into something older, less precise. People no longer spoke of him as someone who might return. They spoke as though his absence were permanent, even if no one could say why. Reconstruction brought new systems of record keeping, but it did not reach backward easily. Clerks compiling registries of displaced persons noted countless unnamed children, many listed only by condition or circumstance. None could be reliably matched to the boy. His silence, once remarkable, now rendered him indistinguishable within the larger tide of loss. What remained distinct were the reactions of those who had heard him play. In later testimony, a former deacon admitted that he avoided music for years afterward. He could not explain the aversion, only that ordinary hymns felt incomplete. "It was as if I had heard something finished," he said, "and everything else felt like rehearsal." Another witness described a lingering unease tied not to fear, but to displacement. She said the boys playing made her feel briefly removed from her surroundings, then returned abruptly. The effect lasted only minutes, but it left her unsettled for days. Such accounts troubled later scholars because they resisted categorization. They were not descriptions of awe or inspiration alone. They suggested interruption, of expectation, of familiarity, of order. There were attempts, years later, to interpret the boy through emerging medical frameworks. Some speculated he may have possessed extraordinary auditory memory. Others suggested neurological conditions that allowed for replication without language. These explanations remained hypothetical, unsupported by examination or documentation. The absence of the boy himself made all interpretation fragile. Without continuity, there could be no confirmation. The case remained suspended between possibility and impression. What distinguished it from other lost stories of the era was restraint. No one exaggerated his abilities with time. The details remained fixed: silence, precision, immediacy. The consistency suggested that memory had not inflated the event, it had preserved it. By the late 1860s, the child's story circulated only when prompted, when someone asked about unusual events from the war years. Even then, it was shared carefully, often with a disclaimer. "I know how it sounds," witnesses would say before continuing. No folklore fully claimed him. There were no songs, no legends, no names attached. He remained unmythologized, which preserved the discomfort of the unknown. In this way, the case settled into its quietest form. It was not unresolved because of dispute. It was unresolved because it lacked the elements needed for resolution. No record of origin, no record of destination, no voice to speak for itself. Only a series of brief encounters that agreed on what had been seen and refused to explain it. The boy had passed through Alabama without leaving a trail the future could follow. And in doing so, he left behind a question that would never quite become a story, only a memory that resisted being put away. By 1868, the case had entered a phase where recollection carried more authority than record. Those who remembered the boy did not argue about what he had done. They differed only in how close they believed they had been to understanding it. The absence of documentation made the memory heavier, not lighter. A circuit rider's notebook from that year contains a brief remark about a silent child of uncommon ear, encountered years earlier. The note is followed by a caution: do not speculate publicly. The admonition suggests that even after time had passed, there was an instinct to protect the event from distortion. What became clearer in later interviews was the consistency of circumstance. The boy was never reported to initiate music. He responded to it. He did not seek out instruments. Instruments were brought to him. When placed before a piano, he listened first, always first, and only then did he play. Witnesses emphasized this sequence with unusual care. One woman recalled that he refused to play when a room was crowded. He waited until several people stepped out, then began. Another said he stopped when a child cried nearby, as though the sound interrupted whatever alignment he required. These details did not suggest performance anxiety. They suggested conditions. The comparisons to blind Tom Wiggins surfaced again during this period, often as a way to reassure listeners that such talent, however rare, had precedent. But those who had seen both insisted the resemblance ended with ability. Blind Tom's public performances were expressive and sustained. This boy's playing was brief, precise, and final, ending without flourish, as though a task had been completed. A former piano tuner offered a technical observation years later. He said the boy favored intervals that resolved tension quickly. He did not linger, the tuner noted. He moved to completion. The remark was offered without interpretation, but it echoed the language others used instinctively. There were attempts to reconstruct the child's route through Alabama using indirect references, church visits, family letters, marginal notes. These efforts produced only fragments that refused alignment. The boy appeared where pianos existed, then disappeared where they did not. Geography, not custody, seemed to determine his visibility. What unsettled later reviewers was the lack of exploitation. No advertisements, no contracts, no guardians presenting him as attraction. In a period when unusual talent was often circulated aggressively, this restraint stood out. It suggested either protection or discomfort, perhaps both. By the end of the decade, the child had become a boundary marker in conversation. When people discussed the limits of explanation, they mentioned him. When they cautioned against turning observation into theory, they referenced his case indirectly. No new evidence emerged. No late witness came forward to claim oversight. The story did not grow. It did not shrink. It remained fixed. The boy had not become legend because no one embellished him. He had not become history because no one recorded him fully. He occupied a narrow space between the two. And in that space the question persisted, not of how he played, but of what it meant that he never spoke, never stayed, and never asked to be understood. By 1870, the child's story had taken on a peculiar stability. It no longer advanced, yet it did not fade. It settled into a form that resisted alteration, repeated with care, stripped of embellishment, and offered only when someone seemed prepared to hear it without forcing meaning onto it. A county school inspector, reviewing informal accounts of unusual pupils from the previous decade, noted one reference to a non-speaking child with complete musical recall. The phrase appeared without follow-up. When questioned later, the inspector said there had been nothing to add. The child had never entered a schoolroom. There were no lessons to evaluate. What became clearer with time was that the boy's silence was not perceived as absence, but as boundary. Witnesses consistently avoided describing him as incapable. They described him as unavailable. He did not respond to questions, not because he could not, but because he did not. This distinction mattered to those who remembered him. A former minister explained that attempts to prompt the boy through gestures or repetition failed completely. The boy would not imitate unless he had first listened. Once he listened, the response came fully formed. He never practiced, the minister said. He arrived already knowing what he was about to do. As Reconstruction reshaped Alabama's institutions, interest in cataloging unusual wartime events increased. Local historians sought stories that illustrated disruption or resilience. The child's case was offered occasionally, then set aside. It resisted framing. There was no arc of progress, no moral conclusion. One editor declined to publish an account of the boy, writing that the story lacked proper resolution. The phrase appears again and again in correspondence from the period. Resolution had become the standard for inclusion. This case had none. Meanwhile, those who had heard the boy play continued to describe a specific sensation, not awe, but recognition. Several said the music felt familiar before they understood why. One woman said it reminded her of a tune her mother had sung once, then never again. She did not believe the boy could have heard it. The realization unsettled her deeply. Medical journals of the 1870s occasionally speculated on extraordinary auditory memory, citing examples without names. It is possible the boy's case informed these discussions indirectly. If so, it did so anonymously, stripped of context. What remained unchanged was the absence of voice. No account ever contradicts this. The boy never spoke, not to explain, not to reassure, not to respond. His silence framed every encounter and defined every memory. By the mid-1870s, those who remembered him were fewer. Their accounts grew quieter, not because doubt had entered, but because certainty had settled. They no longer argued over what they had witnessed. They accepted that it would not be clarified. The child had passed through Alabama during a moment of upheaval, left a precise impression, and then vanished into the larger uncertainties of the era. No institution claimed him. No family reclaimed him. No narrative absorbed him fully. He remained exactly what the earliest records suggested, a presence briefly documented, carefully observed, and then released. And in that release, the case achieved its enduring form, not a mystery demanding solution, but a question preserved by restraint, waiting without expectation for an answer that never arrived. By 1873, the case had reached a stage where absence itself functioned as evidence. Not evidence of wrongdoing, but of limits, of how much could be known when an event left no paper trail and no living subject to consult. Alabama's institutions had stabilized, yet the boy's story remained outside them. A local historian attempted to reconstruct the child's movements by mapping reported pianos across the counties mentioned in testimony. The effort produced a rough corridor, churches, plantation homes, and town halls where instruments were known to exist. The historian abandoned the project when he realized the map explained nothing. It showed where the boy might have played, not why he appeared there or why he left. In letters exchanged among clergy, the child surfaced as a cautionary example. One minister wrote that some gifts resist instruction and ownership. "We mistook witness for custody," he noted. The phrasing suggested a recognition that observation had been confused with responsibility. Medical interpretations continued to circulate quietly. A physician proposed that the boy's silence and musical response could be explained by extraordinary auditory memory paired with developmental difference. Another countered that memory alone could not account for the emotional specificity described by witnesses. Neither position advanced beyond correspondence. Without examination, theory remained tentative. What remained consistent were the reports of how the music ended. Witnesses agreed the boy stopped cleanly, without flourish, without repetition. He did not seek to refine what he had already delivered. This detail, repeated across accounts, distinguished his playing from study or rehearsal. It suggested completion. By the mid-1870s, Alabama newspapers showed renewed interest in unusual wartime stories. Editors sought accounts that could be framed as emblematic of resilience or tragedy. The child's case was submitted more than once and rejected just as often. Editors cited lack of verification, but privately admitted discomfort with a story that refused interpretation. The comparison to Blind Tom Wiggins reappeared in public discourse around this time, often as a way to contextualize extraordinary talent within known categories. Yet those who remembered the boy resisted the parallel. Blind Tom's life, however constrained, was documented and continuous. This child's was episodic and silent. A retired teacher summarized the difference succinctly. One was taught how to be seen, the other would not stay. As years passed, the child's story was told less often, but when it was, it remained unchanged. No embellishments entered. No contradictions emerged. The stability of the account became its most persuasive feature. By 1878, the boy had become a reference point rather than a subject, invoked when discussing the boundaries of explanation. People spoke of him to illustrate how observation could exceed understanding without requiring resolution. The absence of closure did not trouble those who remembered him most clearly. They had learned, through the encounter itself, that not every event invited conclusion. The boy had appeared, he had listened, he had played. And then he had moved beyond record, leaving behind not a legend but a carefully preserved uncertainty, one that Alabama would carry quietly into the decades that followed. By 1879, the child's story had crossed fully into retrospective territory. It was no longer spoken of as something that might be clarified, but as something that had already reached its natural end. Alabama's attention had shifted to reconstruction, education, and progress. The past was being organized into lessons, and this case resisted organization. A state archivist reviewing personal collections from the war years encountered several references to a silent musical child. None of the documents agreed on a name. None offered dates beyond seasons. The archivist noted that the consistency of description suggested a single subject, yet the lack of identifiers rendered the material unusable. The notes were set aside. What persisted instead was professional caution. Music teachers who had heard the story warned students against assuming mastery equaled understanding. "Talent can arrive complete," one instructor said, "but that doesn't mean it belongs to us." The comment echoed the discomfort earlier witnesses had expressed without articulating. In academic discussions of extraordinary ability emerging in the 19th century, the boy's case was occasionally mentioned obliquely. Scholars referred to unrecorded prodigies, whose existence complicated tidy narratives of development and instruction. The Alabama child fit this category precisely, known, yet unclaimable. Several witnesses reflected later that the boy's silence had shielded him from exploitation. Unlike other prodigies, he could not be coached, directed, or promoted easily. His refusal or inability to respond on demand made him unsuitable for sustained exhibition. In this way, his silence functioned as a boundary. The boy's disappearance was never framed as loss in the conventional sense. No one searched for him because no one had possessed him. He belonged to no institution, no program, no record. His absence did not disrupt any system. It merely closed a sequence. A minister wrote in his memoir that the boy taught him the difference between miracle and mystery. A miracle demands explanation, he wrote. A mystery endures without it. The distinction guided how he later approached other extraordinary claims. By the early 1880s, the case had stopped evolving. No new accounts emerged. No contradictions surfaced. The stability of the story, combined with its unresolved nature, gave it an unusual credibility. It had not been inflated by time. It had simply remained. Later folklorists would note that Alabama produced few legends about the child. This absence was deliberate. The people who remembered him resisted turning him into a symbol. They insisted on accuracy, even when accuracy produced uncertainty. The child's legacy, if it could be called that, was subtle. He had altered how witnesses thought about ability, communication, and ownership. He had done so without speaking, without staying, and without explanation. He passed through Alabama at a moment when the state itself was fragmented and uncertain. His silence mirrored the larger silence of a region struggling to make sense of loss. And when he vanished, he did so without creating a void that demanded filling. The case did not ask to be solved. It asked only to be remembered carefully. By 1883, the child's story had settled into a narrow corridor of memory, kept alive not by repetition, but by selectivity. Those who spoke of him did so only when they believed the listener would not rush to explanation. The case had become less about recounting events and more about preserving their shape. A former county judge, reviewing unusual wartime recollections for a private paper, noted that the boy's case lacked the markers typically used to evaluate credibility. There was no escalation, no contradiction, no inflation. The absence of development is itself consistent, he wrote. The observation was not published, but it circulated among a small group of scholars interested in how memory behaves when evidence is scarce. What continued to unsettle these reviewers was the boy's resistance to narrative roles. He was not a performer, not a student, not a curiosity in the usual sense. He did not progress. He did not decline. He appeared fully formed and then withdrew, leaving no arc to interpret. In a letter written by a piano manufacturer, the boy was referenced briefly as an example of how instruments sometimes find their players. The phrasing was metaphorical, but it reflected a common sentiment among those who had witnessed the child firsthand, that the music did not belong to him in the way talent is usually described. It passed through him. There were renewed attempts in the 1880s to classify extraordinary abilities through emerging scientific frameworks. Some researchers speculated about innate auditory processing. Others proposed that trauma could result in selective expression. These theories circulated in journals, but none cited the Alabama case directly. Without examination, the child remained outside study. The comparison to blind Tom Wiggins appeared again in a lecture on musical prodigies, offered as a contrast rather than a parallel. The lecturer noted that blind Tom's abilities, however extraordinary, were documented and repeatable. The Alabama child's were not. One was observed over time, he said. The other appeared complete. As decades passed, the boy's story was increasingly framed as a boundary case, useful not for what it explained, but for what it refused to explain. Teachers referenced it when discussing the limits of instruction. Clergy mentioned it when speaking about humility in the face of unexplained gifts. What never emerged was a claim of ownership. No family came forward in later years to assert lineage. No institution claimed responsibility for his care. The boy remained unattached to any system that could have preserved him formally. By 1887, those who remembered him were elderly. Their accounts grew quieter, not less certain. When asked why they believed the story had endured unchanged, one woman answered simply, "Because we never tried to make it more than it was." This restraint protected the case from distortion. It did not become legend. It did not become proof. It remained an unresolved sequence of events that resisted closure. The child had not left behind teachings or writings. He had left behind adjustments, small changes in how people thought about ability, communication, and expectation. These changes persisted even as the details faded. Alabama carried the story forward without resolution, not because it lacked curiosity, but because curiosity had reached its limit. The boy's silence set the boundary. He had played. He had listened. And then he had gone beyond reach. What remained was not a mystery demanding solution, but a reminder, quiet and precise, that some encounters are complete in themselves, and that explanation is not always the proper response. By 1889, the case had moved fully into what archivists later described as residual history, events that no longer generated new information, but continued to influence how other information was handled. Alabama's records did not preserve the boy, but they bore the imprint of caution his story had produced. A music instructor at a normal school wrote that year about the danger of forcing structure onto ability. He referenced, without detail, a child encountered during the war years whose talent did not respond to teaching. The passage offered no name and no conclusion. It was included not as evidence but as warning. What remained most vivid in memory was the boy's refusal to engage beyond the act of listening and playing. Witnesses emphasized that he never lingered after completing a piece. He did not repeat it unless prompted by sound. Silence ended the interaction. This pattern resisted every framework applied to it. Performance required audience. Learning required repetition. Exhibition required control. The boy aligned with none of these. His behavior suggested a closed circuit, input received, output delivered, connection severed. Later commentators would note that this behavior protected the case from becoming spectacle. Without repetition, there was no opportunity for exaggeration. Without speech, There was no interpretation. The story remained exact because it offered no space to expand. In rural communities, the boy's case was occasionally cited when discussing children who did not fit expectations. Parents were cautioned not to measure worth by expression alone. Some things answer only when spoken to in their own way, one elder said. The phrase echoed language used decades earlier by those who had watched the boy listen before playing. Medical advances at the end of the century brought renewed interest in extraordinary cognition. Journals speculated about cases of hyperacute auditory processing. None cited the Alabama child directly. Without a subject to examine, the case remained theoretical, a ghost at the edge of discussion. The comparison to blind Tom Wiggins appeared one final time in a regional lecture on 19th-century prodigies. The speaker acknowledged that blind Tom's life, though constrained, had been recorded extensively. He then noted that others existed who left no trace, not because they were lesser, but because they did not remain. This distinction mattered. It suggested that documentation was not a measure of significance, but of accessibility. By the early 1890s, the boy's story was rarely told in full. It surfaced instead as shorthand, a reference to restraint, to listening, to knowing when not to intervene. The absence of conclusion no longer felt unfinished. It felt appropriate. Those who had heard the boy play no longer expected explanation. They had learned, through the encounter itself, that some events do not invite interpretation. They complete themselves and move on. The child had entered Alabama's memory briefly, altered perception, and withdrawn without resistance. His silence had shaped the boundaries of inquiry more effectively than any answer could have. And so the case endured, not as mystery to be solved, but as a quiet standard against which other extraordinary claims were measured. When explanation tempted excess, people remembered the boy who never spoke, and they stopped. By 1893, the child's story had narrowed further, settling into a form that resisted even careful retelling. It was no longer offered as an anecdote, but as a reference point, a quiet example used when discussing the limits of knowledge. Alabama's memory of him had become disciplined. A regional historian compiling accounts of unusual wartime experiences noted that the boy's case was the only one consistently described without embellishment. "The details never grow," he wrote. "They only repeat." This consistency, he argued, suggested that witnesses were guarding the memory rather than reshaping it. What distinguished the child from other figures of the era was the absence of motive surrounding him. No one claimed he sought attention. No one suggested he resisted it either. He responded only to sound, and once that response was complete, the interaction ended. The lack of motive unsettled those accustomed to interpreting behavior through intention. A former music teacher remarked that the boy seemed uninterested in mastery. He did not improve because there was nothing to improve upon. He arrived finished, the teacher said. The phrase echoed earlier testimony almost word for word, despite decades of distance. In discussions about whether the boy understood the music he played, witnesses divided quietly. Some believed understanding was irrelevant, that replication alone could produce beauty. Others insisted the emotional specificity of the playing required comprehension. The disagreement never resolved because it could not be tested. The boy's silence complicated every conclusion. Without speech, there was no insight into perception or intent. Observers were left to infer meaning from structure alone, a task that produced restraint rather than certainty. By the mid-1890s, Alabama's institutions had matured into forms that prized documentation and continuity. The child's case, which possessed neither, remained outside their reach. It survived only in memory, carried forward by those who understood that preservation required limits. A minister's unpublished sermon notes that some gifts answer once and do not repeat. The line appears without explanation, but it mirrors language used by early witnesses who describe the boy stopping cleanly, without variation or return. The comparison to blind Tom Wiggins appeared increasingly less useful. Blind Tom's life, though extraordinary, followed a traceable arc. The Alabama child's did not. He resisted categorization because he resisted duration. By 1897, those who had seen him were few. Their recollections had not softened, they had not hardened either. They remained precise, almost technical. This precision protected the story from folklore. It remained unsettling because it refused metaphor. No artifact survived, no instrument, no notation, no portrait. The boy left behind nothing tangible to examine. All that remained was alignment among witnesses who agreed on sequence and effect. He listened. He played. He stopped. That was the entire structure. As the century approached its end, the case had become something Alabama carried without needing to revisit. It had taught a lesson not about talent but about restraint, about knowing when observation must suffice. The child had not been claimed by history because history requires continuity. He had offered none. By 1899, the child's story had reached the edge of living memory. Those who had seen him were now elderly, and when they spoke of the encounter, it was with the careful tone reserved for things that had not been resolved, but also not misremembered. Alabama no longer sought to understand the boy. It sought only not to distort him. A county archivist reviewing oral histories that year remarked that the child's case was unusual for what it lacked. There was no conflict, no climax, no consequence that could be measured. "It does not behave like a story," he wrote. "It behaves like an interruption." The observation was never published, but it circulated privately among scholars. What endured was a shared agreement about boundaries. Witnesses continued to emphasize that the boy was never pushed to play, never encouraged to repeat himself, never questioned afterward. They recalled a collective instinct to stop once the music ended, as though continuing would violate something unspoken. One woman described the silence after he finished as heavier than the sound itself. She said no one moved, not out of awe but uncertainty. "It felt finished," she said, "and we did not know what came after finished." As Alabama entered the new century, interest in cataloging extraordinary individuals increased. Universities gathered case studies. Journals sought examples, yet the child remained absent from these collections. His case could not be submitted because it lacked the elements required for analysis. Later commentators suggested that the boy's silence protected him from being absorbed into systems that might have exploited him. Without speech, without repetition, without compliance, he remained inaccessible. His talent existed, but it did not belong to anyone else. The comparison to blind Tom Wiggins, by now firmly established in public record, served as a contrast rather than a parallel. Blind Tom's life demonstrated how extraordinary ability could be documented and controlled. The Alabama Child demonstrated what happened when it could not. By the end of the decade, the boy's story functioned as a reference point for restraint. When people debated whether to pursue explanation at all costs, someone would mention the silent child from the war years, and the conversation would pause. No effort was made to locate descendants. No attempt to reconstruct a biography succeeded. The child had entered the record briefly, altered perception, and exited without resistance. As the 19th century closed, the case did not demand conclusion. It had already completed its work. The boy had shown that sound could exist without language, and that meaning did not require permission to pass through. And in Alabama, where so much history had been reshaped by force and loss, that lesson endured quietly, untouched by theory, preserved by silence, and unresolved in the only way that mattered. By 1903, the child's story had crossed fully into the background of Alabama's historical consciousness. It was no longer something recalled spontaneously. It surfaced only when prompted by discussions of memory, silence, or the limits of explanation. The case had become a reference without a file. A professor reviewing 19th-century Southern accounts of extraordinary ability remarked that the most credible cases were often the least complete. "They end where our questions begin," he wrote. The observation aligned closely with how the silent child had been handled, observed carefully, then released. Those who still remembered the boy described the same sequence, unchanged by time. He was brought into a room. He listened. He played. He stopped. There were no additional details because none had ever been present. The absence of narrative growth suggested that memory had preserved the encounter exactly as it occurred. What distinguished this case from others was the absence of interpretation even decades later. Witnesses resisted explaining the boy's ability through religion, science, or folklore. Each of those frameworks had been available to them. None had been applied fully. The restraint appeared intentional. A retired minister explained that they had sensed the limits of language at the time. "Anything we said would have been smaller than what we heard," he said. The remark echoed earlier, accounts describing the silence that followed the music as deliberate rather than stunned. Medical science at the turn of the century had begun to classify conditions related to speech and cognition more formally. Some researchers speculated, in abstract terms, about children who processed sound without language. Yet without examination, the Alabama child remained outside even speculative classification. The comparison to blind Tom Wiggins, by now part of public history, continued to surface as a point of contrast. Blind Tom's abilities had been studied, managed, and repeated. The silent child, had not. He had never stayed long enough to be studied, and never responded long enough to be directed. By this point, Alabama's institutions had fully embraced documentation as authority. The boy's case, which lacked documentation by design or circumstance, no longer fit the era's expectations. It survived only in oral form, protected by the care with which it was remembered. No artifacts remained, no musical notation, no instrument associated with him. The absence of material evidence prevented reinterpretation. Without objects, the story could not be reshaped. As the early 20th century progressed, the boy's story was occasionally referenced in discussions about whether every event deserved explanation. Those who cited it did so sparingly, aware that overuse risked distortion. The child had not become legend. He had not become proof. He had become a boundary, marking where observation ended and assumption should stop. And in Alabama, where history had taught people to be cautious with certainty, that boundary endured quietly, long after the last witness was gone. By 1907, the case had passed almost entirely beyond narration. It existed not as a story to be told, but as a posture inherited. Alabama no longer remembered the child's presence directly. It remembered the discipline his silence had imposed. A county archivist compiling summaries of unresolved 19th century accounts noted that some events resisted both verification and dismissal. The silent child was listed among these, not with detail but with a single notation: observed, not concluded. The phrasing suggested acceptance rather than neglect. What remained striking to later scholars was how little the case had changed across decades. Memory usually exaggerates or simplifies. This one did neither. The lack of embellishment implied that witnesses had agreed, implicitly, to protect the event from interpretation. In interviews conducted with descendants of those who had seen the boy, references surfaced indirectly. One woman recalled her grandmother insisting that some experiences should not be repeated for effect. "She said we saw it once and that was enough," the woman explained. The instruction echoed the restraint first shown when the boy was alive. The child's silence continued to shape how the case was treated. Without speech, there could be no confession, no explanation, no clarification. Observers were left only with structure: listening, playing, stopping. This structure became definitive. Medical advances by the early 20th century offered new vocabulary for extraordinary cognition, yet none of it reached backward to claim the child. Without examination, diagnosis would have been speculation. Alabama's approach had already rejected that path. The comparison to blind Tom Wiggins appeared one final time in a scholarly footnote, not as parallel but as contrast. Blind Tom's life illustrated what happens when ability is documented and managed. The silent child illustrated what happens when it is neither. By the end of the decade, no one expected resolution. The case had aged out of inquiry. It had not failed to conclude. It had concluded differently, by refusing expansion. The boy had passed through Alabama during a moment of upheaval, altered perception, and then vanished into the larger uncertainties of history. His silence ensured that no one could claim authority over his meaning. What endured was not mystery but boundary. The child marked the point where explanation stopped being appropriate. And in Alabama, where so much history demanded interpretation, that restraint itself became the legacy, quiet, intact, and unresolved. By 1910, the child's case had reached the outer limit of its historical window. Those who had witnessed him directly were gone, and those who remained knew the story only through careful inheritance. Alabama no longer treated the event as something incomplete. It treated it as something finished in form, if not in explanation. A regional historian reviewing accounts of wartime anomalies wrote that the silent child represented an event without consequence that nevertheless changed behavior. The phrasing was deliberate. The boy had left no damage to repair, no injustice to prosecute, no narrative to correct. What he left instead was recalibration. The most consistent element passed down was not the music itself, but the pause that followed it. Descendants recalled elders emphasizing that silence had not been confusion but acknowledgement. "We knew it was over," one remembered being told, "and we did not try to keep it going." This detail mattered. It suggested that the witnesses had recognized a boundary in the moment itself, not retroactively. The decision not to push, not to question, not to repeat, had been made instinctively and collectively. Scholars later argued that this instinct separated the case from folklore. Legends grow when people seek meaning aggressively. This story endured because meaning was withheld. The boy was not framed as miracle, warning, or symbol. He was allowed to remain what he was, an occurrence. The comparison to blind Tom Wiggins faded almost entirely by this point. Blind Tom's story had entered textbooks and concert histories. The silent child's had entered posture. One was preserved through repetition, the other through restraint. There were no final claims made about the boy's fate. He may have lived quietly elsewhere. He may have died unnoticed. The absence of certainty did not trouble those who inherited the memory. The story had never depended on outcome. What survived most clearly was the agreement across generations that the event had not asked to be explained. It had asked only to be observed faithfully. By the second decade of the 20th century, the case existed only as an echo, triggered when someone insisted too quickly on explanation, or attempted to claim ownership over what could not be held. Alabama carried many such echoes. This one endured because it was precise. A child arrived. He listened. He played. He stopped. Nothing followed because nothing needed to. The absence of conclusion was not a failure of record. It was the natural end of an event that had already completed itself. And so, as time moved beyond the reach of witness and record alike, the silent child remained exactly as he had been remembered from the beginning, unchanged, unclaimed, and unresolved, not because answers were missing, but because they had never been required. The final trace of the case does not appear as a discovery, but as a decision that was never reversed. By 1913, when Alabama's historical societies formalized their boundaries for what constituted recordable history, the silent child was absent, not overlooked, but intentionally untouched. A senior archivist later explained that some events resist classification because they do not behave like evidence. They offer no contradiction, no escalation, no aftermath. The child's case, he said, had been complete the moment it ended. To extend it would have been to change it. What endured instead was posture. Educators emphasized listening before instruction. Clergy spoke of restraint when faced with unexplained gifts. Physicians cautioned against diagnosing without examination. None of these practices cited the boy directly. They did not need to. The influence had already settled. No attempt was ever made to recover a name. No search launched for descendants. No retrospective theory gained authority. The child's silence ensured that no one could speak for him. Not then, and not later. In later reflections on 19th century Alabama, scholars noted that the region produced fewer legends than neighboring areas. They attributed this to a cultural habit of allowing some events to remain unexpanded. The silent child stood at the center of that habit, even if unnamed. The comparison to blind Tom Wiggins, once useful, finally fell away. Blind Tom belonged to history through repetition and documentation. The Alabama child belonged to memory through limitation. One was preserved by exposure, the other by release. There were no ruins to visit, no instruments to examine, no records to restore, only a sequence remembered with care. A child appeared during a time of upheaval. He listened. He played, he stopped, and the people who witnessed it did the one thing that ensured the event would endure without distortion. They let it end. In Alabama, where so much history demanded explanation, this case survived by refusing it. The silence that framed the child's life also framed his legacy. Unresolved, unclaimed, intact, and even now, long after the witnesses are gone and the records have aged, the story remains exactly where it was left, not as a mystery demanding solution, but as a reminder that some truths pass through history only once, and that listening sometimes is the final and proper response.